All right. Hey, everybody. So, my guest today joins us from the UK. He is someone with lived experience. He is the principal consultant for Epic Global Solutions. Their mission is to learn from lived experience to take the problem out of gambling and potentially save lives. Dan Spencer, welcome to the Modern Meeting.
Hi, Adam. Thanks for having me.
Of course, yes. Another great person that I met in Columbus sings a mean Love Shack.
I didn't expect you to bring it up so early. I definitely expected you to bring it up, but maybe not in the opening couple of sentences. No, Columbus was a good time.
Oh, that was awesome. But no, just another amazing person that I met with lived experience, and yeah, I mean, I'm just excited for you to. I haven't heard your story. We'll talk about Epic, but yeah, before we get to Epic, let's dive in. So, it's the same question I usually ask everybody. Do you remember the first time when you realized you may have a problem with gambling?
That question ended in a different way than I was anticipating it. So it's quite clever, because I thought you were going to say, do you remember the first time that you lost control, like when you had a problem? But maybe this is me being a bit of a smart ass, but when I realized I had a problem with gambling was like 2 weeks into recovery, maybe.
Wow. No, I love that.
Because it was all reflective, right? It was all like, yes, I'll go to GA. Yes, I'm asking for help, and I'm willing to accept help, but not truly, not until it sunk in a couple of weeks in. I think once I heard some stories that were similar to mine and thought, that guy's definitely got a gambling addiction. So if I've done similar things, maybe I have. And then I guess when some of the suggestions started working, then there's that kind of giving over to, I'm probably in the right place. These things are helping. And yes, I probably did have a problem with gambling.
That's amazing. I mean, I've asked a lot of people that question and no one has ever answered it that way. I love that. So what brought you then to, I mean, not to go all the way to the end of the story, but if it took you 2 weeks to realize you had a problem, what initially brought you into the room? Did someone make you go?
Desperation. Or? That's one of the first things I saw. I mean, we're kind of doing a Tarantino on the story here. We'll skip around. I love it. And, I think it's much better than starting at the beginning. But I actually ended up in a Narcotics Anonymous meeting 3 months before I ended up in a GA meeting. So
okay,
I had a problem with drugs towards the end of my problem with gambling. Kind of thought the problem was the drugs, but actually the drugs was a home remedy to some of the undiagnosed mental health issues that I had going on, caused by and related to gambling disorder. So yeah, that was one of the first things I saw in a meeting. Was the word God in capital letters on the floor, and I thought, oh God, I'm not going to fit in here.
Right.
And it was spelled out, the gift of desperation, and didn't make sense at all at the time. But now I understand that had I not have been so desperate, I never would have stayed. Had I had any other options, I wouldn't have come back to a second, third, fourth meeting. They used to say, if you spend your time hanging around a barbershop, eventually you'll get a haircut. That's what they told me.
Right.
I spent my time hanging around that barbershop, and the haircut got me in the end. And just really trying to learn the true meaning of what it is to accept help. Because I think elsewhere in my life, I'd asked for help before. Sure, I had, but I'd never really accepted it. Anytime I had a problem where I felt like I'd broken down to the point of I can't go any further with anything in life, asking for help was more about pausing and stopping and figuring it out myself and going forward. Whereas this was truly accepting suggestions, accepting things way outside of my comfort zone or what I believe to be the right thing to do, and just going with the journey. And that's what's been beautiful about recovery for me.
Absolutely. So, let's go to the beginning. How did it start? How did the gambling start?
Well, I guess I tell this story as part of the work that I do, and I always kind of go back to a picture of me at 4 years old. It's the earliest picture of me that I have, and it really, for me, anchors in the earliest memory that I have. And that would be being at home in front of a TV screen with a horse racing on. And this was a typical day in my household growing up. My dad, I think I can look back now and say he was a gambling addict, or he had a problem with gambling. He never admitted that in his lifetime, and it wasn't really spoke about growing up because he was a very low stakes, low level gambler, but gambled pretty much every day on horses, slot machines, things in the pub, and he spent an awful lot of time doing it. I think he neglected other areas in his life because he was doing it. So kind of talking about the three main ways that gambling harm happens: time, money, cognition. You know, there was problems in all three areas, but I would say his main one was the time and cognition. And that earliest memory kind of has me thinking about other times I spent at home as a kid, cheering on dad's horses and being involved in gambling at a really young age, where money just wasn't a part of gambling. It was all about other things. It was all about celebration, commiseration, being a sports fan, I guess, to some degree, as much as you can be a sports fan of that kind of thing at that age. But yeah, 4 or 5 years old, running my hand along the glass of a TV screen, trying to physically push a horse to run quicker, because it's kind of a funny image, isn't it, of a 4-year-old doing that, and completely harmless in my view, looking back, even with my kind of hindsight. But then when you boil it down, which I did obviously in therapy, following GA, I did quite a lot of therapy. You look at kind of the connection to my dad that I clearly wanted at that age and couldn't get elsewhere. Or you look at what would the household have been like if the wrong horse wins, and what would the household have been like if the right horse wins, and then does that lead to allowance and sweets and toys and games and a better environment. So the motivation was definitely there. So I would say I was kind of involved in gambling at that stage where money was not a consideration. And it's kind of cyclical, isn't it? Because that's where I end up 16 years later, where I'm gambling and money isn't the object or what I'm chasing. It's all about something else. So that's been kind of a common theme in my gambling, is that money really wasn't a strong motivating factor. It was just a currency of, getting it done, I guess.
So you mentioned that it sounds like, he was low stakes. So I think of I feel like a lot of our parents and grandparents, like I know that some of these older people, that they played the lottery every day, right? They gambled every day of their lives. But because it was such a low amount of money, like you said, they lost the time, but they didn't lose the money. So in your professional opinion, like, is that a different type of compulsive gambler because they're not losing the money? Or is it essentially the same thing because it's grabbing a hold of them and it's something that they're doing every day?
Well, I guess your question relates on how much weight you put on the word compulsive.
Right.
Because if that's the way we're going to measure it, then it's all about choice and continuation. And addiction can be broken down into continuation, control, lack of control, and that continuation. So continuing even though the consequences are bad. That to me is what boils down to, does somebody have a problem with gambling to an addictive point? Because you can talk about stigma. I'm sure we'll get onto kind of public stigma. When you ask the public what they think about gambling addicts, it boils down to the same stigma of, really and truly, if you're in an honest conversation, they'll say that they're greedy, they want a shortcut in life, they're unintelligent, they don't understand that the house always wins, that kind of thing. And we know that's not true if we're talking about gambling not being about money. And then you could say, well, gambling addiction comes down to, well, somebody can't stop, they can't stop. And I would say that that's not really true either, because you and I know loads of people who stopped, one way or another. And we were talking the other day about how you and I went through GA and therapy and kind of traditional routes, but there are people out there that literally just stopped. And I wouldn't go back and say didn't have a gambling addiction, got to the same depths that I did. Sounds like it was as severe, sounds like there was really not in control, and managed to white knuckle it out. That's an option. It's not an option I would advocate for anyone, but it's an option. So
Right.
then it doesn't come down to, well, it's someone who can't stop either. So for me, it's about, it comes down to logical decisions, and I have quite a logical brain. I find it hard to do anything really based too much on emotions or illogical maps of thinking. And if I think back to when my gambling addiction was at its worst, I was making decisions that made zero sense at all. You know, it didn't matter about a big win that I was chasing or anything like that. It would have made no difference at all. The best thing I ever did was lose the money, Adam. You know, had I not have lost the money, I never would have stopped.
Right.
So I'm thankful that I lost the money that I did. But when you get to the point of making a decision that has no logical outcome, no logical sense there's no good that can happen out, but you still make those decisions. That to me is what boils down to that continuation, that kind of what it's about. So bringing it back to the question about money and time and cognition, I don't think it makes any difference to me whether time is your problem, cognition is your problem. Usually it's a mixture of all three. You know, if you're making illogical decisions to continue in a behavior that you know has no good outcome time and time and time again, that's where we are.
Totally. So, it's one thing to be, a teenager and you start dabbling in gambling like I did, but for it to be it sounded like the center of a lot of things for you at such a young age where like, I mean, that's where we have like the root of everything, like, right? Like when we're 4 or 5 years old, like, so looking back on it now, do you believe like if your dad wasn't watching the horses every day, do you think that eventually you would have found your way to gambling, or was this something that was kind of made by him and by that that desire for you to like have that connection with him?
It's an interesting question. It's something that I've done a lot of work in therapy on.
Mm.
I had to make some decisions around that, and I guess fundamentally, I have chosen to take the responsibility on what happened 100%. So I don't blame my dad, my parents, the environment, the culture in the UK, the gambling industry, anything like that. 100% I made all the choices, and I made a series of particularly bad choices in my younger years that I found really hard to get out of that cycle in my later years. So no, I don't think it was kind of put on to me by my upbringing. I think I would have always found myself towards something. And I did a bit of studying into, and forgive me, I can't quote my source on this, but as a university, I think in the US, that models addiction on a syndrome model. And this is something I found in the early days, so I'm not sure if it's still out there now, but that model looks at the creation of addiction without a subject attached to it and later attaches a subject to it. So you have things like trauma in your upbringing, which I had through a violent father, and then an event kind of in your usually adolescent years as you're kind of becoming a man, and my parents got divorced and I went through some big changes in my life, kind of career-wise and education-wise around the kind of ages of 18, 19, and felt myself a bit kind of lost in life at that point. So you could call that the event. And then the third building block is, what target is this person going to gravitate towards to act out in this kind of creation of an addiction? And not everybody will believe in that, and I'm not saying it's true. It's one model of addiction, but it's one that I really identified with because I thought that my target was so easy to choose because I had that upbringing, right? I knew what gambling was. I knew how to read sports form books. I knew how bookmakers worked. I had online gambling accounts by that point. I had ambitions to be a professional poker player. Gambling was all around me. And crucially, it wasn't a secret. Everybody knew that I did it. So if I was going to lean into something destructive as part of repetitive behavior to deal with some kind of internal need, which is what addiction's about, it was always going to be gambling for me. And I think if I didn't have that upbringing and the gambling wasn't maybe front and center, maybe I would have chosen something that was a bit more accessible, and it would have been alcohol or it would have been drugs or something else. But for me, that thing was always there. But my transition from the early years into adolescent years into being an adult was me leaning more and more into the gambling world. I made it an identity of myself. So that choice of what to lean into was was pretty obvious for me.
Mm. So you mentioned the gambling culture in the UK, and I know because being at the conference and hearing some speakers talk, I wasn't aware of this, but basically everything that happened in the US in like 2018 when everything started being legalized, you guys did that back in like 2005, 2006, right?
Yeah, I would say so. Yeah,
So
yeah.
take us through, how did that affect you, and did was that kind of, in because it was so mainstream years before the US, when did you go from cheering on your dad to actually making the bets yourself?
I think gradually over time, you'd still be in childhood at that time. He used to take me to greyhound racing tracks a lot, horse racing stadiums and things like that, and put bets on for me and allow me to pick out who I thought was going to win the races. And still very low level. Me and my sister given 50p per race to put on, that kind of thing. That transition really happened around the ages of between the ages of 16 and 18, I would say, to a more serious level. So key moments growing up there: when I was 15, I got my first job in a fish and chip shop. As I always say, is the government make us do that as part of being a Brit.
Best fish and chips
Um,
ever. Oh my god.
so I'm working in this fish and chip restaurant, and the first week I'm doing double shifts all week long. My hands up for everything, loving it. And at the end of the week, they give me my pay packet, and it's in cash, and it's £90. It's the most money I've ever seen, right?
Mm.
At 15 years old. And I remember having that feeling of, this is my money, and I've got no responsibilities. I can do anything I want. I can go and buy anything I want with this. And what I chose to do is I live in Brighton, in a seaside town. Is I went down to Brighton Pier, which is full of amusement arcades, which for those that might not know, certainly back then, and this is slowly changing now, but there are a category of slot machine in the UK that has no legal age limit, so kids can play them. So I
And they
went
can win
there,
money?
yes, but it's capped at like a low level
Oh my
stake
god.
and a low level prize. They're now changing that into kind of winning tickets, but the problem is it's still the IP of a slot machine. It's still the
Sure.
mechanics and function of a slot machine. But back when I was playing them, it was for real money, and it was for what I would consider a lot of money at that time. So that's what I did with the first pay packet that I got. Was I went to Brighton Pier and I spent all day playing these machines, and I lost every penny. And I remember feeling sick, and I remember feeling guilty, and I remember thinking, is somebody going to ask me, what happened with this money? And I'm going to have to lie. And then linking that to all the effort I'd put into making that money, right? And kind of learning a lesson that every child needs to learn, but probably not in that way, about budgeting and the rest of it. And then that should have been the end of the story, end of podcast, because I'd learned it the hard way and I never went back. But
Lesson
I went
learned.
back every week and I did the same thing. So I
Right.
had this lifestyle at 15 where I'd work my ass off through the week and then lose the money on these machines. It was pointless. And as the weeks went on, I knew I wasn't going to win back what I'd lost. And that's where I consider my addiction to have started, because it's at that point where I'm making these illogical decisions to go back, even though there is no good outcome. And I wasn't even enjoying it anymore, but it just became part of me. And that's when, around the age my parents got divorced, and I was pretty self-isolating at that point, just wanted to spend time in my room, go to school, go to work, go to these machines and switch off, really. And
Yeah, I
that
mean,
was life at 15. Yeah.
I know what that exact feeling feels like when I'm in my 20s and 30s, but to be doing that at 15, I cannot imagine. I cannot imagine, what that felt like. So, were were your friends noticing this? Like, where's Dan? Oh, he's down at the arcade again? Or was just
Yeah, but that was just me, Adam. I think
right.
if you were my friends and you'd grown up with me, you would have seen this thread of gambling all the way through my life. But
Mm,
it was the one thing I was most passionate about, really. That and
mm,
music. But that hadn't really started in my life at that point. So I was the kind of guy that if we went out for dinner, I'm betting on whose plate's going to come out first and what the waiter's name might be, and or these kind of things, because I just looked for opportunities to gamble, and most of the time it was fun, but
Right.
especially when I'm with friends, or it's social gambling, and things like that. But when I was on my own, that was the bits that they didn't see, is that I just didn't stop. I just carried on. It became very sad and kind of, didn't really have a purpose other than, escape and isolation. And I couldn't have told you that at the time. That's kind of looking back. And as I went on past 15 towards 18, I was gambling in bookmakers underage. I was skipping out of classes at college. I'd started to get into very low level debt, but crossing these lines of kind of, it's okay to be in debt because of gambling, and started to formulate this thinking that you'll relate to, and know this from people you've spoken to, about how you justify your actions. So for me, it was okay to be in debt as long as I was never in debt to directly gamble. So I would never borrow money to gamble with, but I would gamble with all the money that was for my bills and food, and then borrow money to
Exactly.
backfill that. It's that kind of thinking that ingrains yourself in over the years, that makes you convince yourself that things are okay to do in the moment that you're doing them. But yeah, I started to make some bad choices, and I guess a series of bad choices as I turned 18. So the legal age for gambling was, I'd already decided by that point I wanted to have a serious go at being a professional poker player.
Mm.
And, I guess in a GA room, I'm swept up in this generation of people all my age that were caught up in this Chris Moneymaker era of poker, where Adam's waving at me, he's the same, where we were inspired, and like, I didn't know who Chris Moneymaker was at the time, but I was inspired by the fallout from it, if that makes sense.
Mm.
So I never saw him win the World Series of Poker. I never knew he was the first amateur to do it, and that he'd just learnt poker, gone and won the biggest tournament there was, and became a millionaire overnight. I understand that now. But what I had seen was the number one Christmas gift all around the world that year was a poker table and chip set. So
Mm-hmm.
they were going around everywhere. Me and my friends had one. We were playing in my friend's kitchen. I was getting into all of the nuances of poker, like how to shuffle chips and shuffle the cards properly, and know all of the different terms, and trash talk at the table and all that kind of stuff, before I was
Mm.
18, before I could kind of legally play it. And then 18th birthday, another series of bad decisions where I didn't have a computer, so I signed a finance deal on a £1,000 computer that I had no idea how I would pay back. It was like £1,000 over 4 years or something. So I was like, well, that's not much money per month. That, that's easily paid off. Got a credit card, because I can get a credit card at 18. That comes through. It's got like a really low amount on it because I just turned 18. It was like £300. I put the two together and I deposit all of the credit card amount on an online poker site, and I'm
Mm.
off and running, and realize that I'm not as good as I was when I played with my underage friends, when I'm playing with adults online. And again, I learned the hard way, right? I lose the
Mm.
money. Initially, I do well, and I don't understand basic concepts like, if the money's on the table, I can lose it. I don't understand that concept. So when I
Mm.
run my 300 up to 600 or 700, I don't realize that that's now on the line. Um, I don't realize what APR is, or what a credit report is, or a credit score is. So when I don't pay the credit card back, I just cut it up, put it in the bin, and thought, nobody's going to come after me for that, because I haven't got £300 to pay them. So what are they going to do? I haven't got a house they can take away. I was
Right.
18 years
Right.
old. So I just ignored every letter they ever sent me about that £300, until finally they wrote it off, and I defaulted on the card. And here's me thinking, I won. I won 300. I had free money. No
Right.
concept of what those consequences would mean.
Mm.
Um, so didn't learn the lesson, because really that's a lesson I should have learned before I'm doing that stuff.
Right. So you're talking about social gambling and poker, and we don't talk a lot about poker on the modern meeting, but it's I think we should dive into it, because I was the same way. But the thing about poker is that, like you said, it's with friends. It's usually a long period of time where, you know, I might play for hours and I lose under $100 compared to a casino where $100 can go like that. So during those times, were you able to gamble socially and then once everybody left, you were able to leave with them, or did you continue to gamble? And then like playing poker, were there any red flags for you where you noticed like, okay, why am I the only person who's rebought 4 times and the rest of my friends aren't?
Yeah, poker evolved kind of alongside the whole timeline of my gambling, I would say.
Mm,
So earlier on, you're absolutely right. Poker's to me wasn't gambling at that time. To me, it was a way to spend an evening. It was an investment. I was learning something. I was socializing. I loved playing face to face in person in a casino. That was my ideal. But I also played at home. But actually, looking back, I played a hell of a lot of it. You know, for somebody who wasn't doing it as a job, you know, I had a full time job. Most of my years that I spent gambling, I think I averaged around 40 hours a week of online poker
wow.
alongside my full time job. It wasn't working from home or something. You know, I worked in a supermarket, as well as going face to face at the casino at the weekends. I was doing it non-stop anytime I could. You know, I don't think there were many conversations me and my wife had at that time that I didn't have a laptop in front of me that had poker going on the side. And there wasn't really anything too much to hide in the early days. You know, I was a low stakes player. I definitely was a low stakes player in any form of gambling, you know, including sports betting, slot machines, poker, whatever it was. I liked to do it a lot for a low amount. And on poker, I would play like 10 cent, 20 cent blinds. And then as the years went on and that problem grew, that still looked the same to the people around me, namely my wife at home. What was different was behind that poker screen that I was playing 16 tables at once towards the
Jeez.
end. And I was playing free play or very low money stakes poker tournaments that were masking the higher amounts behind it in the window. So I
Mm,
was juggling these windows. So if she saw the screen, she wouldn't see what was really going on. But I would say the big problem came with me. My lifestyle in gambling is that every month I lost more than I had. And that was the end of it, really. You know, it didn't matter how much I have. It didn't matter if I won, I lost it, and then a dollar, you know, whatever it was.
right, right.
And quite often I went over that line of this is money for bills and food and holiday savings or whatever it was, then had to recover that money. And I went chasing after it with gambling and invariably failed, and then went down the payday loan cycle.
Mm,
And that's really what I guess I would say caused the most problems for me
mm,
was payday loans, because I would get into this loop, and the loop would last anywhere between 6 months and 2 years, let's say.
mm,
And what I mean by the loop, and this is what I called it in my head, was I would be £200 short of paying my rent, so I borrowed 200, and now I owe 300. So I pay back the 300 the next month, and now I need to borrow 400, and I owe 5. And it would go up and up and up every month. And every month I would have enough money because whatever I dipped into my bills and food account, I covered with the loan, and then I paid it back, and the interest was mounting. And there was no deadline to that because they would never say no. You could always borrow more money. The problem came when the single payment was more than you earned in a month, because then you would have no way of paying it.
mm,
And when that happened, you'd have to get another payday loan to pay the payday loan. And if you did that, you were screwed, because then the next month there was no way out. And sometimes that would take 6 months, because what would save me was I would hit a big win. And if I hit a big win, I guess I was quite good, quotation marks, in this sense that when I hit wins, I paid off my debts,
mm,
and it would reset everything back to square one. But then I would kid myself that was always going to happen. And I
mm,
began to get superstitious about this. I began to feel there was some kind of gambling god out there that would let me get into trouble up to a certain amount, but then would always let some kind of big win happen. And I went through that cycle 6 or 7 times throughout those 16 years, where the payday loans hit the terminal amount where I didn't know what I was going to do next month. And then a big win came and wiped it all out, and I carried on. And I would say to myself, let's not do that again. That was that was a stressful 9-10 months or whatever of thinking. Like, there were times where I was thinking, I've got 3 months left until I'm going to have to kill myself because I can't pay this debt back. And I'll count that back. Like, now I've got 2 months left. Now I've got I've hit a big win. I pay it all off. Right, don't touch payday loans again. You can still gamble, but don't touch it. But it would still happen again and again and again and again.
I have so many questions. First question is, so you mentioned that you were married. You mentioned, I know that you always held a job, and it also sounds like you were basically kind of like hiding in plain sight. Like she knew you were gambling, just didn't know the extent of it. What was that like, walking around with that stress of like, people know what I'm doing, but they have no idea like what is actually happening?
Well, I guess going back to question number one on this episode, which was, when did you realize that you had a problem? I didn't realize I had a problem. So in my mind, the only thing I had to hide was the debt.
Okay.
And in some instances, I didn't hide it. So I went to friends and said, look, I've been stupid and taken out a payday loan, and it's spiraled out of control, and now I owe £1,000. And one of my friends took out an advance on his credit card to pay off my payday loan, and then I paid him back over a year. Another one gave me cash to pay it off, and I would make these small admissions, but each one was in isolation. If you put all the pieces together, that's where there was a secret. And I guess the bank statements would have been a huge, I would have been so embarrassed to show someone my bank statements at that time with the amount of gambling transactions going through. But the gambling behavior, I felt it was my right to do it. I felt it was my choice to do it. And I knew the risks I was taking and who was going to stop me. And I also felt like life kind of wasn't worth living without it, which is horrible to say considering all the great stuff I had going on in my life. Like you say, I didn't lose my marriage. I'm still married now. We have a great marriage today. I kept my job. I didn't lose my job. In fact, over that 16-year period professionally, I did very well. I learned a lot. I worked in great teams. I got promoted up through the ranks. I was earning a fairly decent salary towards the end. And I guess work was a time where gambling couldn't get in the way because I was physically in a place working with a team. I couldn't do it. I could talk about it all day, and I kind of did. But work felt like the break in my life. It was the personal life that felt so full of stress. And then I guess if you fast forward towards the end, about when those payday loan loops, I didn't get out of a couple, and that's where everything kind of came to a head at the end. The big secret then was the fact that I was hugely depressed, that I wasn't sleeping. I had debt that I didn't know how I was going to pay back. I had bailiffs that were constantly coming to my door, and I had to try and stop my wife from seeing them. And I'd come back to a note on the door one day saying that I'd been taken to court and I hadn't paid my council tax, and that's an imprisonable offence in the UK. There'd been a court date, I hadn't showed up to it. There was all this kind of stuff that had been being blocked out by my brain. And that was the time where I was really living one day at a time, which is ironic that that's what you're told to do in recovery, because I was doing that in addiction, right? I was like, I don't know what I'm doing next week or next month or next year. I'm probably not going to be. I'm probably going to be dead. I don't care about that. I began to fantasize about suicide. But I could go one day, but it was a miserable day of the overwhelming feeling to do with the secretism. Have I invented a word? It works.
I like it. I like
the
it.
overwhelming feeling for me was guilt, and that's
Right.
like the feeling of guilt today has an attachment of some kind of PTSD in me because of the amount of nights I laid there in hot sweats, not being able to sleep, just feeling extremely guilty about what my life could have been if I hadn't have been gambling, and lying next to the woman that put her trust in me, and I'd broken it so many times, and guilt because I'd started to come to terms with the fact that I was going to end my life. And I've spent so many nights justifying that to myself that when I finally ended up in medical care after my first attempt to end my life, I was trying to justify it to the therapist there that was a logical thing to do. And I've since found out that a lot of people in that situation tell the same kind of story. It seems logical in that instance, but I was almost trying to convince the therapist that she should do it. You know, it was so ingrained into my brain
Wow.
that life was meaningless. And that's so sad because I look back now with 7 years in recovery, living a wonderful life that I'm so grateful for, thinking that how could I not even see one inkling of that? I couldn't see a bit of it. I couldn't see any light that I could grab onto that would make this life worth living. And now it's the most precious thing, you know?
Mm. Two questions. First question is, at any point during all of those dark days and nights, did you say to yourself, like, I want to stop gambling? Did you
Never,
say that? Never,
never.
never. Okay.
No.
And then the second question is, which it just left my brain, but I'm gonna think about it. And I'm gonna cut this.
Sorry, I interrupted you.
No, no, not at all. It had to do with shit. Oh, I'll think of it. God damn it! It
You
had to
think?
do with
Let me expand on the never thing, and you
yes,
can think of
yes,
the question.
yes, 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 yes.
I never did, and I guess like some things got in the way, because that first time that I considered taking action on these suicidal thoughts, I live on a cliff top, and it was the middle of the night, and I'd walk down to the cliff top, and I'd climbed the fence, and I sat on the edge with my legs over the edge, and there was like chalk crumbling from the cliff, and I couldn't see the bottom. It was pitch black, and I was terrified. I was shaking, and I kind of knew in that moment that there's no way I'm going to jump, because it seemed like the human body had this inbuilt mechanism to stop you doing that stuff.
Mm.
And I just kind of sat there really scared, but also in awe of the human reaction to this, of it's kind of piecing together, why can't I do it? You know, I so desperately want to do it, and I kind of don't have a choice because it's payday tomorrow, and this money's going to leave my account straight away, and I'm going to have to admit some stuff. I don't know what, I've got no options. So I can't face tomorrow, but I also couldn't end it that night. And that put me in a period of kind of true desperation. And in that moment of desperation, I phoned the Samaritans suicide hotline, because that's what you're supposed to do, I guess. And I had nothing to lose. And the woman on the end of the phone said to me, have you considered the fact that you might have an illness and you shouldn't listen to what your brain's telling you to do? And I hadn't considered that. I'd considered that I was a bad person. I made bad choices. I was now living with the consequences of those choices. And everything was a decision that I'd made. And it was my fault, right? And I promised her on the phone that I would go and see a doctor the next day. And I did. But by the time I got to the doctor, I'd already decided I wasn't going to mention money and I wasn't going to mention gambling, because if I did that, there would be pressure put on me to stop. And I couldn't stop because, one, I didn't know if I could. I didn't think that was a promise I could make and keep. Two, I didn't know how to. I didn't know any methods. I didn't know about GA. I certainly couldn't have been convinced to go at that time. And number three, I didn't want to. You know, this was Dan. This was me. All of my life was surrounded by gambling. It's what brought me the highest highs, albeit the lowest lows too. But I lived for it, and I couldn't picture an identity for me going forward without gambling in it that I wanted to live.
So I thought of the question. When you get to that point where you consider taking your own life, what percentage of that is the disease, and what percentage of that is like mental health, a chemical imbalance in your brain, or like how much of it was the guilt from gambling, and how much of it was just something that was a part of your brain?
It's a great question, but almost impossible to answer. I feel.
No,
I
know.
guess I'm gonna have to do some kind of live reflection in the moment. But I certainly had a number of mental health disorders and illnesses that were undiagnosed, that were related to gambling disorder at the time. I was going through probably severe anxiety, definitely depression, suicidal thoughts and that kind of stuff. And the way I was dealing with it was not good. It was all kind of, wasn't admitting it, wasn't open to the fact that I even had these things. Trying to make logical sense of illogical conditions, really. And I don't know what came first, the suicidality or those conditions, but I feel there's definitely a link between them. I
Mm.
guess I guess suicide had to become the only option, and a lot of that comes down to financials. I know gambling is not a financial issue, and we learn that when we come into recovery. But my decisions at that time were based on financial restraints. I feel like had the debt not been there, I never would have ended up on the cliff top. I
Interesting.
felt like I would have gone on day by day for as long as I could, and when that debt was going to creep up to the fact that, I mean, the elephant in the room is there was a way out of all of this, right? The way out is to ask for help,
Right.
and it's crazy to think back now that was so unfathomable that I could ask for help, that I would look at all of these things to do first, borrow
Mm.
amounts of money I couldn't pay back, tell lies to the people I love, end up on a cliff top, phone the Samaritans, eventually start taking drugs when I'd never taken drugs. I was not into drugs all of my life, but I ended up with a cocaine problem because I was self-medicating the depression. Again, didn't see that at the time. I just saw it as I was at a party one night, it was Friday. I had the opportunity to take cocaine, and I thought, I'm going to kill myself on Monday anyway, so why not? And for one night, I found a way out of that depression in an instant. I felt like the old me again. I had a reason for living, and then it all wears off and all the depression's back. So then I started using that to kind of self-medicate. And then I really did have a secret Adam, because now my wife was living with a secret drug addict. And that to me was a problem. Whereas the gambling, I couldn't see it. The drugs, I could.
Mm.
So eventually I came out of the blue after using drugs for almost a year and told people I had an issue with them. And that's how I ended up in an NA meeting. But I still wasn't willing to admit the gambling because I just didn't see it as a problem. I didn't link the two.
So you're meeting with the therapist who you were trying to convince that it was a logical idea to take your life. How and so then from there you start using cocaine, still gambling. How long did it take from that point in order for you to get to a GA meeting? How did you find out about GA?
So I eventually admitted the problem with drugs. And I just broke down on a night out when I'd been using, and I'd used more than I usually would. And I was a bit of a mess. And I ended up crying in front of friends and said, got a problem. And to be honest, during that time, it become I couldn't hide it anymore. So it started showing physical signs. I was super skinny and kind of washed out, and people would hear me mention it, overhear me talking about ways to get drugs and things, and certain friends had kind of put two and two together and understood what was happening, and that it was a bigger problem than perhaps I was making out. But when I kind of held my hands up and said I had an issue, I guess I was ready to cry out for help. And what should have happened was I should have admitted everything. I should have admitted the gambling, everything. People could have connected those dots, got me to the right places. But I just wanted to hold that one thing back because it was too dear to me. But I ended up in an NA meeting and I started, I got recovery with the heroin addicts. That's where I got recovery, was sitting in those circles and listening to someone who had had one of the most extreme stories of addiction you can imagine. Homeless, street using, injecting heroin, all of that kind of stuff. But was now sitting there, to me, presenting as someone who had their own successful business and had 10 years in recovery and looked like an upstanding member of society and had this incredible story, not of addiction, but a story of recovery. And I wanted that. And I had that kind of glimpse of what life could be. But I knew I could never have it without admitting the problem with gambling. And I knew deep down I would never do that. So I was going to NA meetings, trying to borrow money off people. And, I remember I was getting like a new contract for a mobile phone. I was trying to sell it to someone before I had it, to get the money for gambling. And I stopped everything but the gambling at that time. I was going to NA, and I was pretty wimpish about going, to be honest. I bought the book, and I thought maybe I can just read the book. I don't have to go to a meeting, So I start reading the book, and it starts talking about mind-altering substances. So I say to myself there, right, no drugs, no alcohol. I'm stopping smoking. No sugar, no coffee. Cut everything out like a proper addict would. Cut everything out day one. And then I thought, okay, I'll read the book. They do phone meetings. I'll do a phone meeting. So I did my first 30 days clean, quotation marks, because I was gambling my ass off still, Did my 30 days reading the book and doing the phone meetings and not sharing, not talking, just listening on the phone. And it was an actual phone meeting. It wasn't Zoom or anything like that, And then after 30 days, I thought, people keep talking about these key rings, and you get a key ring after 30 days. And I want that key ring, I want that. So I've got to go to a meeting. So after 30 days, I go to an NA meeting, and they welcome me in with open arms. And I start having these experiences of listening to the heroin addicts and understanding that the only key difference between me and that heroin addict is heroin. Everything else is the same. Everything else is the same. And I get my key ring, and I think, right, now I want the 3-month one, the 1 month to 3 month. So I start going to a meeting once a week. And then after 3 months, just completely break down because the gambling's got so out of control. It was like a leaking bucket where you plug in one hole and the water's spouting out with double the ferocity out the other hole. It's completely out of control. So that payday loop happened again, but it happened the quickest it had ever happened because the amounts were so much more. I was now online slot machines at £50 per spin, fast spin, like the double click, the stop the reels kind of thing. Just doing that. And then the last night I gambled, I was in that same kind of situation I was when I was on the end of the cliff. It's payday tomorrow. Payday loan companies are going to take everything at 1 a.m. or something. Rent's due, everything's due. Don't know what I'm going to do. The only way out, and this was with my most logical brain functioning at that time, this was the best idea I could come up with after days of thinking. 1 minute past midnight, I deposit everything onto an online slot website. No doubt, looking back now, it was a black market slot website because I'd excluded from all the mainstream ones at that time. £50 spins. I do the feature where the feature where you can buy the bonus rounds. You're straight into the bonus round.
Oh yeah.
I was doing that, and I thought I'm going to gamble my whole salary until I reached this magic number, which I thought was about 10 grand, or I'm going to kill myself. And that was the plan. And I lost all the money, and I spent the weekend Googling ways to end my life. I made a spreadsheet of like the methods and the percentage of survival chance, so I could go for the lowest one. And the lowest one was shotgun. I didn't have that option. The next one was a cut on your arms, and that's what I went with. And I cut some gruesome bits out, but I ended up on the bathroom floor Monday morning, back in that state of desperation of not quite being able to go through with it, but not being able to face life either. Exactly the same as when I was on the cliff top, although this time there was no fear. This time it felt much more, I guess, rational, much more realistic that this was going to be my last moments. And I guess another logical thought entered my head that probably saved my life, because I thought, well, if you're really going to go through with this, why wouldn't you tell someone? And if you don't like the result, you can still kill yourself. That I'm laughing. It's not funny, but this is
No, but
this,
yeah.
it's funny to me because it's completely illogical.
Mm.
And the person I phoned, if I had to make a list now of people I'd phoned in a crisis, this person would be, 100th on the list. But in that irrational moment of thinking, I was like, I'm late for work. And I phoned my boss to apologize for being late for work. And he said, well, where are you? And I just cried over the phone, told him everything, and
Wow.
gave him what would have been the worst day of his working life,
Yeah.
because he had to deal with that now. He's now got a suicidal employee on the phone out of nowhere, someone that he didn't think he had to worry about.
And
And
you were in like a management level position at that point, right?
yeah, I was senior. Um, I was in professional management coaching for one of Britain's largest supermarkets.
Yeah. I mean,
Hundreds of people that relied on me, and yeah, they didn't feel like they needed to worry about me. But that job had brought me freedom to indulge in the addiction, and I was holding secrets for them people too. And my mum still worked for the same company, and I think someone got hold of her, and she managed to come and pick me up and clean up and sat down. And my sister was there, so it was me, my mum, my sister, and they said, what's wrong? And for the first time in my life, I told the truth, and that began my journey towards recovery. I still had to tell my wife. My bag was packed when she came home from work, and I said, "Sit down. I need to talk to you." Bearing in mind, I'd only made the admission about the drugs 3 months earlier, so I'd had my one kind of chance, and I didn't even trust myself to tell her the truth in that moment. So I'd written a list, and I screwed up the piece of paper, and I put it in her hand. I said, "Don't read that. I need to talk to you." And that was just to keep me honest in that moment. I've got to tell her everything now. It's in a note in her hand, So I told her about everything that wasn't paid, and it was purely a financial conversation, Adam. It wasn't me saying I'm a gambling addict or I've got a problem with gambling or anything like that. It was very factual about, I haven't paid the council tax, I haven't paid the rent, I've sold this and that and the other. It's all gone on gambling. I haven't stopped. I've borrowed loads of money. I've been paid today. The money's already gone. And at the end, she said, "Is that everything?" And I said, "Yes. There's a list in your hand, of what I needed to tell you." And her reaction, Adam, was she threw her arms around me. She said, "We'll get through this together."
oh,
And that's where, like, I think about the 16. Why did it take 16 years? All I had to do was ask for help, and it was there. It was there in an instant, the minute I said it. And I went through all that sleepless nights and thinking I had to kill myself and I had to do all these stupid things. And I used the word unfathomable. I can't even say unfathomable earlier, to think that I would ask for help. And it took so long. I'm such an idiot. And it was there all along. And that help and support has been unwavering between my friends and my wife and my family ever since. And that's what's brought me 7 years into recovery today, is their support.
before I ask you about recovery and Epic, I just had one observation through listening to your story. So you said earlier, the first question I asked you, you didn't think you had a problem, yet you did self-exclude yourself, right? You
Yeah.
self-excluded yourself, and in NA, you had that thought of like, I can never have what that guy has, that business owner, because I know I can't stop gambling. So don't you think that like subconsciously, right? Because like, why would you self-exclude yourself if you didn't think you had a problem, right?
Yeah. I can give you some bad logic for that too, as I have done all the way through my life. But the bad logic to me was, self-exclusion was a way of managing my play to help me win more.
Oh my God.
This is going to be an interesting answer, right?
Oh, that's great.
And I talk about this in my work now, about how people misuse, safer gambling tools. I would exclude on one site to enable me to play more on others, because I thought I had a bigger chance of winning with another site, or maybe poker was a problem, but what was really the problem was the PokerStars quick play tables. So I would
Oh my
exclude on
God.
that site, and then I'd go and play on a different one. And earlier you mentioned about how poker wasn't really hardcore gambling. It had taken a whole night. The way I gambled with every product had changed so severely that I turned everything into gambling. So
Mm.
I still play poker, but this time I played those spin and go tables. Are you aware of these?
No.
So let's say it's a sit and go with 6 people in, and they all put $5 in, and the pool is $30. Instead of the pool being $30, a slot machine would spin, and
Oh, I have.
sometimes you'd be
Yep.
playing for $10, sometimes you'd be playing for $200.
Right.
So I'd play a bunch of those. I would
Mm-hmm.
play cash poker instead of tournaments. I would play various different stakes, and I would almost turn every hand into, you can play poker a million and one different ways, right? I was taking those big gambles on the poker table, whereas I used to play very methodically, very mathematically. I was now the aggressive player at the table, and not in a
Mm.
good way.
Mm.
I was the fish at the table, basically.
Yeah. Yeah. Yes.
So I turned that way of gambling into something it shouldn't have been.
Mm.
So I
So,
excluded, like poker stars, I excluded myself for 5 years at one point, and I
wow.
sat that out, and I counted down the days, and I was back on it 5 years to the day.
Mm. Mm.
So, and I was excited about, like, in 6 months I can play poker stars again.
Right.
And I jumped site to site, excluding myself from sites as I went, and I waited out those exclusions, and I came back. And that's how I ended up, probably looking back now, on a lot of black market sites, but I didn't know that at the time. I don't even know it now 100%, but
Mm.
sites nobody would have heard of.
Yeah. Um. So yeah. So I mean, I've taken up way too much of your time, but I want to hear. So
It's all good.
as far as recovery, just explain how. When did it first? Like, when was that first like aha moment in GA, and how did it lead to you eventually working for Epic?
Yeah, so don't know. There was an aha moment actually in GA. I guess it happened kind of slowly. I mentioned kind of being 2 weeks into recovery before I realized I had a problem. That's Celeste. There wasn't a day where I was like, oh, I must have had a problem. But I came into GA kind of primed and ready to go, because I knew what an A meeting was about, and an anonymous meeting was about, because I've been in
Mm.
NA. And in NA, everybody had a sponsor. Everybody worked the steps, no exceptions. That was my experience of NA. I'm sure that's not the same in every meeting. When I got to GA, it wasn't the same. And from what I speak to people around the UK, certainly with GA, I don't know how it's in the States, is that it's not very common for people to have a sponsor and work the steps. They should, it's what the book says, and that the structure isn't really there in the membership to make it happen in a lot of meetings. The meeting I went to, meeting number one, I said, who does the sponsoring around here and can help me get through the steps? And there's a guy, Neil, running the meeting, and it was like his gift had just walked in. He's waiting for a newcomer to come in and say, I want to work the steps, because he wanted to work the steps with people. He was free and open to do that. He'd committed to that in his recovery. And he had 12 years, I want to say. No, I think he's got 12 years now. So I think he has 6 years or so. He had an amount of time that I found unrealistic and unbelievable, quite frankly. When somebody tells you they've got more than a year or two.
Mm.
But he said, what kind of commitment can you make? And I said, well, I'll come to your house every week, and we'll work through the steps, and
Right.
we'll do it in your time. I'm just open to do whatever you tell me to do. And that was the big commitment I made in GA that I never made in NA. Was I told myself at that time, not only am I going to go to these meetings, I'm going to do anything that somebody with a successful recovery tells me to do. And that stood me really well, because I had so many defensive reactions to suggestions that I had. Don't believe in God, so I'm not doing any of that stuff. I haven't got enough time, so I'm not going to more meetings. Don't want to get involved with doing service in the meetings. Don't want to take time out of my day to go and help a newcomer, because I should be working on my own. I had excuses for everything, but I ignored every single one of them. And I just had this hands up mentality around, if you tell me that I should do it, and you've got either a longer recovery than me, or a more successful recovery than me, or you have something in your recovery that I want, then I'm going to do it. And that led me doing all sorts of stuff. I went on adventures in my recovery. I went to like an eyes open meditation center at some point, and that was really freaky, and turned out to be a cult, so I didn't go back. But we did all sorts together, and I just did everything this guy told me to do and had complete trust in him. And eventually he turns me over to kind of doing everything a higher power tells me to do, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I don't want to dismiss that. My higher power wasn't God, and it wasn't anything overly spiritual. It was a sense of good direction was all it was.
Mm-hmm.
It was kind of a theoretical, and this is kind of me like being the good atheist I am. I have to have a caveat behind everything spiritual. This was me saying, hypothetically, a good version of you in the future would want what out of you now? So
Mm.
kind of like looking back on a, and that came from somebody else who said his higher power was him in the future. And I thought, what a narcissist. That's a bit of me. I'll have that, But as long as it's not you, and as long as it's something that wants good for you, I think you can get over the higher power stuff,
Mm-hmm.
because it's not a big feature in my life now, but I love the serenity prayer, as lots of people do in recovery. I love the feeling of, I prayed on my hands and knees every day for a year, despite not being religious, because I was told to do it. And I learned a lot in that journey. I don't feel like it would hold a benefit in my daily life today, but there's nothing bad about sitting in the morning and thinking, what do I want to get out of this day? And then sitting again in the evening going, did I get what I want? What do I want tomorrow? Because that's what praying is, morning and
Mm-hmm.
night kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
And then I went on to gratitude lists, and that did a great thing. And then I went on to journaling, and then eventually I helped somebody else through the steps, and then that had me reflecting back on the way I went through the steps. So I was a grade A student in early recovery. I've got to say, I was that kind of hands up, I'll do it. And then that got out of hand, then I'm going to 6 meetings a week.
Mm.
And that's not a normal way of thinking and living, I'm sure there were times when my wife thought it was better when he was only at the casino 3 times a week,
Right. Need that.
So
You
I had
need
to get
that
that in
balance.
balance. Yeah.
Yep. Yep. Yep.
And then coming into Epic, I mean, I think I was 2 years into recovery, and
Mm-hmm.
reflecting back on, as I always was, on some of the bad, some of the good I'd done, and I look back on my career, and as I mentioned earlier, I worked for a supermarket, and I did a lot of years in a lot of my time there in HR and regional HR management. And I think I reflected back on a time where I fired 3 or 4 people that had been stealing scratch cards from the kiosk in the supermarket. And that was something I regretted, right? Because I kind of knew at the time that they had a problem with gambling as I did, but I couldn't speak up because I had that secret that I was hiding, and I kind of felt sorry for them, and I kind of put my feelings on them at the time, and I felt bad about that. And that had come up in step 4. So step 4, listing out all your kind of wrongdoings as part of that. So I went back and I did a bit of research around, well, is this common? Does this happen? And around that time in the UK, there was about 1 case a week coming up in court where someone had stolen scratch cards from their employer, and they'd got away with a lot of money for a long time. They didn't have any money to pay back because they were gambling addicts, and not a lot was being done to prevent this. And I thought the only training we used to offer people was make sure your customer's old enough. There was none of this kind of make sure they don't buy enough. That stuff is all in place now. So the lottery's come a long way since there. So there are kind of guidelines, restrictions, safer gambling measures in place. But I thought, who could possibly provide this training, even if we did train the staff? And I found Epic, and they were working in this kind of prevention space and education space for a while at that point. They've been in business for 12 years now. I've worked for them for the last 5 years. And our work is all about preventing gambling-related harm. Now, some of that is about stopping it happening in the first place, like the work we do with kids in schools, trying to teach them about what can go wrong and how to safeguard and to be aware of this kind of stuff, and the link between gaming and gambling and all that kind of stuff. That's another subject. And some of it is in specialist areas where we know the risk is higher. For example, in elite athletes and sports organizations, in military organizations, educational services, criminal justice, and the gambling industry themselves. So yeah, preventing it either happening in the first place or minimizing it because we're having those kind of reflective conversations and getting people to understand what's happening and get into recovery sooner. So we don't work in the treatment space, but everything we do is in professional kind of consultancy, training, education, and awareness to help businesses fend off the threat of gambling.
Mm. It's funny because this is kind of a full circle moment for me, because I want to say 6 or 7 months ago, I went to it wasn't really a conference. It was more of just like it was something in Rhode Island, but there was this guy there from this company called Epic. I hadn't heard of them, and it was Paul. And Paul told his story. Um, and I had a conversation with him and Patrick. Shout out to them. And I remember leaving there, if I'm being honest, thinking I didn't get anything out of that whole day listening to all the operators and listen except Epic. Oh my God, Epic, right? And then, I continued to follow them. And then when I meet you in Columbus and you say you work for Epic, I was just like, it makes sense. Because like, I just feel like all you guys are just like, I mean, you guys are just amazing. Like cause I'm not I'm because of people like you, I am able to look at this whole landscape in a more with a more open mind, right? Like instead of just being like, how can you guys, how can you guys partner up with DraftKings? Like, well, no. Like, we're not, like you said, like you're not in treatment. Like you guys are in prevention, and these companies are willing and they want to put these things in place, right, to help people. I don't want to say I don't like the word gamble responsibly, but just to educate them, right? To let them know, you know, what could happen, what can happen, and if you're feeling a certain type of way, like this is how you can avoid that, right?
Yeah, in some ways, what will happen?
Right,
Addiction will always happen
right.
with any pleasurable activity in life. What it could go for a whole list of things, but there will always be people addicted.
Mm-hmm.
There will always be connected to the subjects that you connect to addiction. And our job, I guess, depending on what industry you're in, if you're in the gambling industry, is to identify where you have players that are addicted or have problems or are developing problems while playing with you, and get to those people and try and stop that escalating. And sometimes it will have already gone too far, and it's all about kind of getting them into treatment or signposting them to treatment. And sometimes those things are kind of developing as you watch the account history. And that's what really interests me, because this is how we kind of reverse those problems happening as they develop. I think it would be completely honest and transparent of someone to say that a lot of gamblers chase losses now and again. A lot of gamblers spend more than they wanted to now and again. And not every one of those stories needs to end up with a story like yours or mine.
Right, right.
There are some people there that can go, all I needed was a bit of education about gambling addiction, or
Yeah.
all I needed to know was that this is perfectly normal, and those limits that you can set on the sites are not just for gambling addicts, they're for everyone, and I can have one, and it's all right to hit a limit now and again and say, I've had enough today. There are some people like that. I'm not going to tar every player with that brush, because there's a severity index of addiction, from mild harm, or not even harm, kind of like signs of harm leading into the harm, leading into gambling disorder right at the end. We call it the epic spectrum. We have a spectrum that explains this. And your approach has to be different for different players on that spectrum. But that is my mission, calling in life, passion right now, is to stop people halfway up those spectrums and turn them back to stay in a safer place where they can continue doing what they presumably enjoy for the rest of their life. And my interest is not in making more money for the gambling operators, but I'll sell it that way because it does make more money for the gambling operators if you can take money at a responsible level for someone's whole lifetime. And guess what? There's no fallout for the harm for that. Now,
Right.
like I said earlier, that won't be every player. There'll be players that have gone too far. We need to get them off the platforms. That's the other half of the focus. We need to get them off the platforms with great signposting of where to go for help, and we need to identify them. And I've done a ton of work in kind of AI detection algorithms to work out the behavioral elements of what people are doing, because it's personal to me and my story, right? No algorithm would have picked me up because my stakes were too low. I didn't play all night long. I still had a job. I did these things that meant I wasn't part of a VIP system. I spread my play across loads of different operators. I did all these kind of things, right? But today the algorithms do pick me up because of the behavioral elements that I was engaged in. So we've done loads of work in that. But yeah, prevention and minimization is, one and the same to me.
Dan, I can't thank you enough. I appreciate you sharing your story. I'm so happy for you that, you know, I can't get the image out of my head of you sitting on that cliff, and now look at you now. I mean, it's just amazing. You know.
Thank you, Adam.
Any
Yeah.
yeah. Any parting thoughts or any where can people find you, find Epic?
Yeah, you can find Epic at epicglobalsolutions.com. You can track me down on LinkedIn. Unless you're a sales manager, they get deleted immediately. Marketing managers, sales managers. But other
Yeah.
than that, pop me a message on LinkedIn and we get in touch.
Awesome. Dan, thank you so much. Definitely going to have you back on the Modern Meeting again at some point. Really appreciate the time.
Thanks, Adam.
All right. We'll be right back.